I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Inez Stepman.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. So welcome back, everyone. As usual, we have a well-rounded and pretty newsy show for you today. So Ben is going to kick us off with the rumors that have been going on for days now about the potentially looming indictment of the 45th president of the United States, Donald J. Trump. We will have lots of takes on that, I am sure. Inez will then talk about President Biden's first veto, if I'm not mistaken, of his entire presidency. It was an anti-ESG bill, so a lot to discuss on that. Emily will talk about this recent rendezvous between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin in Moscow, and then I will kind of stay on the foreign policy front and take us home by rounding out the show with a perspective on the Iraq War 20 years after the U.S. troops marched into Baghdad. So, Ben, why don't you get us started here?
Well, we're recording on Wednesday, and news just broke just before we started recording that there would be a surprise no grand jury convening in New York today. Typically, as I understand it, the grand jury convenes Monday, Wednesday, Thursday. There will be none today. This comes on the heels of potentially sort of damning public testimony given by lawyer Robert Costello, who had previously represented Michael Cohen, who is supposedly the star witness in this case that we're going to be discussing, I guess, the merits and politics of today, which is this impending potential indictment of former President Donald Trump in New York by a Soros DA, Soros-backed DA, Alvin Bragg, who has failed to prosecute numerous crimes in New York City, but here appears to be trying to conjure one up, a novel case, as even those on the left acknowledge, to pursue these charges against President Trump. These are considered, I think, probably the weakest, according to legal experts, of any of the charges that are potentially outstanding against him in venues from New York to Georgia, and then obviously to DC as well. And President Trump himself sort of announced that this was coming via social media and called on folks to protest on his behalf, which I think one of the remarkable elements of this is the fact that the sort of widespread response was, why protest when we're going to end up like January 6ers in pretrial detention for months, and you're going to have the feds infiltrating, et cetera. And that was sort of the tongue in cheek, but also serious reaction, certainly across the Twitter sphere, which I think in and of itself speaks to how far beyond the Rubicon we've gone from the Mar-a-Lago raid to now, that people would be afraid to protest, to exercise a constitutional right, precisely because they see how the powers that be, the ruling class, has used that as a pretext to crack down on individuals and eviscerate liberty and justice in this country. I would say at the outset of this that I think that to the extent this indictment does go forward, this is Banana Republic, third world territory, and that we should think of ourselves as operating in a fundamentally different country than the one we grew up in, period, full stop. We can talk about the charges that are being bandied about. It appears to be that there's an effort to use these extortive hush money, so-called payments, to claim that business records were falsified around the classification of those payments, and then as well to move this from a misdemeanor to a felony, that actually these were campaign finance contributions that were characterized otherwise, and so that there was then intent to commit a crime on top of the purported falsification of these records. There's a whole bunch of legal maneuvering that you have to follow to get to this point. There are issues around state versus federal crimes potentially at play. The fact that on the campaign finance side, the feds themselves have refused to pursue any such charges pertaining to the facts of this purported case. We can talk about statutes of limitation at play and beyond. I think it's all, frankly, secondary or even tertiary to the fact that this is obviously a show me the man, I'll show you the crime. And I was doing a little thought experiment before about all of this quote unquote novel sorts of grounds that have been used to go after anyone and everyone who dares dissent from ruling class orthodoxy. And we can go back to raising of the Logan Act with Michael Flynn and false statement charges that the agents actually thought were true statements. At the time, this Douglas Mackey case where they're talking about using disinformation to deprive people of the right to vote. So trying to throw a memester in jail. Obviously, FARA has been used and abused of late. And then, of course, obstruction of an official proceeding, which was a Sarbanes-Oxley related charge, leveled for the first time, really, in any kind of analogous case with the J6ers. And we can go on and on. This is the utter evisceration of our legal system. It is obviously the pursuit by a current regime of the predecessor presidency and frontrunner in the Republican field going into the 2024 campaign. So none of this is new, but I think, I don't know if you all share this, but I have a sinking feeling around this, akin to the Mar-a-Lago raid, because it's almost worse in some ways that they're conjuring up with the most asinine possible set of charges here to try to pursue the former president, as the opening shot into other charges likely to come from other venues. The rule of law is just gone. It's totally eviscerated in this country. It's a banana republic. And I'm not sure how we get out of this morass, but I think that in terms of our orientation, in terms of our thinking about politics, about law, and about the state of our republic, we have to operate under the assumption that we're operating in a fundamentally different country today. So I don't know that I necessarily have the antidote, but I'd open it up. What are your takes on all this? Obviously, there's many hot takes about, what does this mean for 2024? And does this boost Trump's chances in the primary and hurt him in the general, et cetera, et cetera? We can talk through all of those issues. We can talk about Governor Ron DeSantis' response to this. I think we ought to open the conversation to any and all threads.
I think the conventional wisdom that this helps Trump is wrong. I'm open to being wrong myself on that point. I don't think it's helpful for anybody to have the photo op of being perp walked. Whether or not Bragg actually does perp walk him is a different question. He certainly wouldn't have to. But they're sort of foaming at the mouth over this opportunity. So it's easy to see him making that decision. Trump, according to the New York Times, if we believe the failing New York Times, is also sort of eager for this photo opportunity. But on that note, all I wanted to say was emphasize the point Ben made about having a sinking feeling. When this news started to play out last week, my stomach literally dropped because it's just a very, very frightening. It's sort of like, I'm thinking about this because of the SVB stuff, but it was sort of like in 2008, how you just see some of those headlines that would be like a punch in the gut, and it all cascaded and snowballed into what became the Great Recession. And this feels like that on a different scale, that we're cascading into Banana Republic territory. The House Oversight Republicans released really damning information about the Biden family last week, showing transactions between a Chinese company, a Biden business associate, and then all of these Biden family members to the tune of about $1 million in the span of several weeks in 2017. Media barely touched it. So imagine the media barely touching any of this, and then Trump being arrested. I mean, it is just not a healthy recipe. It is not a recipe for healing. It's a recipe for sinking further into division and rancor. And finally, in this case, it's not justified because we're ratcheting up a misdemeanor at best to felony, which makes it so much worse.
Yeah, I would only underscore a few points that both Ben and Emily have made. One, the above the law point that keeps getting thrown back. I said this during the Mar-a-Lago raids, but I think it's worth repeating here, which is that, we have this norm. Everyone's always talking about norms on the left, right? We have this norm for a reason. We don't arrest the domestic political opposition, right? Which is not to say that they're above the law. If, like, Donald Trump shot someone on Fifth Avenue with a bunch of witnesses, right, nobody would question this. But to break that kind of 250-year very critical norm of being very cautious about applying a weaponized, even the appearance of a two-tiered justice system on the side of the regime versus the side of domestic opposition is so serious that basically, if you're going to do this, you better have like some very, very serious crimes with very, very like solid evidence. And it appears that Bragg doesn't have that. And the crimes on themselves, the crimes on their face, even if they're true, are very minor. In the case of this filing, it essentially amounts to a bookkeeping error that is only a felony if we can prove that Trump really did it for his campaign and not so that his wife would find out about it. Like, this is the sort of stuff that this case would turn on. And I think it's not the stuff, it makes it even more obviously political, right? And with regard to the political reaction, right? Ben, I think, really importantly brought up the fact that there has been very little protest is actually, I think, both a good thing in the sense that I think it means that people are waking up to the kind of regime that they live under. But I think it's an indication. I don't think it's an indication as some of the gloating sort of left-wing headlines have been, oh, like Trump doesn't have a base anymore. No, I think people are realizing that the legal system and the rule of law, they cannot count on the application of the rule of law, that coming out to protest for Donald Trump, especially in blue states, and this is something that our friend Jesse Kelly also has been hitting on, is actually dangerous under this regime. And I think that knowledge has disseminated among a large part of Trump's voters, and that's worth noting, as depressing as it is, and as true as it is, I think. And then finally, there's just the additional knife in the gut about this. You know, Donald J. Trump is the only person Alvin Bragg is even remotely interested in prosecuting, you know, in the city of New York, right? This is a guy who wanted to knock down armed assault and not arrest people and not charge people who are committing violent felonies in the state of New York. So I just think that's worth noting. This is a Soros-backed DA. This is an activist DA who basically, as a principle, does not believe in enforcing the rule of law, and yet he's going for these, like, you know, ticky-tack charges in a highly politicized way against Donald Trump.
All right, 3 quick points in very quick succession. One is on the substantive merits of the charges. This is obviously frivolous. I don't even feel a need, frankly, to unpack it. My very liberal, lifelong Democrat grandfather was over for Sunday brunch last Sunday. Even he was laughing to me and said, "This is obviously absurd. It is facially stupid." So there's that. The second part, though, that we have not commented on, and I feel does need a comment, is that I think that Trump and some in his most innermost circle, their reaction to immediately try to shift tactics and not talk about Alvin Bragg, but talk about what will DeSantis do? Will he stop this? Is also frankly absurd. And it is absurd for 2 reasons. One is that Trump himself has openly and fairly explicitly talked about the fact that he is voluntarily and happily going to surrender himself. He will fly up to Manhattan. He will enter his charges in person. And that's fairly obvious because Trump sees himself rightfully in this case as the victim and the martyr, and being the victim and the martyr is his most natural element. Also, constitutionally speaking, we're not going to go deep here, but Article 4, Section 2, Clause 2 uses the word shall on demand of the executive authority from which the person is fleeing. There is really no room for discretion here. That was affirmed in a 1987 Supreme Court case called Puerto Rico versus Branstad. So the legal argument fails as well. The final thing, and real quick, and then we'll transition back to Inez here, is that it just reminds me of something that I have said on this show many times, is that the only way out here is through people. The only way out is through. The pendulum has shifted so far to one side. If Republican prosecutors across the country in our own jurisdictions are not going to start trying to weaponize the rule of law within the confines of prudence and reason back to at least get us back to somewhat of a stable equilibrium, then we are all screwed. So the pressure from right-wing activists across the country has to be on Republican prosecutors to, within the confines of prudence and reason, reciprocate in kind. That has all sorts of ramifications for Fauci, the Biden family, things of that nature. But we'll kick it now over to Inez for a separate topic on Joe Biden and ESG.
Yes, so this week, Joe Biden issued his first veto against a bipartisan piece of legislation, passed the Senate 50-46. Of course, side note here, that's because there are 2 Democratic senators who are more or less incapacitated and not showing up, Dianne Feinstein and Fetterman, right? But nevertheless, you know, there are 2 Democratic votes on this in the Senate. And that was to overturn a Biden Labor Department regulation that was issued that gave fund managers broader powers to take into account ESG factors when making investment decisions. And this is with people's retirements, right? And not just 401k, but also pensions for states and so on and so forth, right? So that's the background, which sounds very boring, but I think it's actually extremely important. Basically, a lot of what we call woke capital, right? There are incentives, investment incentives built in that to essentially have the corporate sphere go ahead and but not only invest their money, but put into their advertisements, all the things that annoy a lot of conservatives when they watch ads, right? Basically, their allegiance to a whole series of woke causes. Well, that's not just because of the fact that they have young employees coming out of universities, although that is an important factor. It's also because now major hedge funds are looking at these scores, these ESG scores, when they determine, for example, who to lend money to. And that actually shifts the financial incentives within the quote unquote free market, which is not a free market, in favor of companies doing a lot of this essentially social activism. So it makes it harder for Republicans like Ron DeSantis or others to for example threaten Disney, right? It makes it so that Disney's not just afraid of political consequences, they're then on the other side afraid of financial consequences, losing their rating and therefore losing their ability even, for example, to go to banks and take out money. And this has all come to a head, I think, through a lot of energy companies, right? And I think this has the potential, now that Biden's vetoed, first of all, it shows where the Biden administration is. And I think it's very interesting. The veto message that he put forth with it was not anything about the actual substance of ESG. It was, hey, Republicans are trying to, screw working people by making poorer financial decisions with their investments, or allowing poorer financial decisions with those investments. He's trying to make essentially the economic argument. That economic argument rests on a series of platitudes that I think this downturn in the economy is going to start to blow up. One of them is that ESG investments are inherently doing better. There is actually an economic positive, not just a political argument for things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. The argument, the platitude goes, right? The company that invests in diversity, equity, inclusion will have more voices in their boardroom, and they'll be better prepared to sell to a multi-ethnic market, right? Those things sound nice, and they've been poured in CEOs' ears for a long time. I think we're going to see the rubber meet the road on some of these things. And I think that's going to continue to be a really important debate as some of those bottom lines start to dry up. And you have examples of CEOs like Elon Musk who are actually looking to cut the fat of a lot of this stuff that will start to impact their quote unquote their ESG scores, and therefore what kind of money they'll have access to in terms of venture capital. All of this stuff, our entire financial system is set up in favor of a lot of this stuff, and has been slowly set up that way since the last financial crash in 2008, when basically I think the public perception was the financial sector got away with murder and were bailed out and did not suffer for it. And therefore the response over the last couple decades from that sector has been, well, look at us, we're good corporate citizens, we care about all of these woke things, without changing the underlying financial structures or the fact that bailouts create massive incentive for malinvestment. So I think this is going to roll into the SVB stuff. It's going to roll into as we move potentially towards a recession. I think this is going to continue to pop up. But important to see Joe Biden, as always, kind of delivering the old school Democrat labor message out of one side of his mouth, while literally doing the exact opposite and actually weighing in on the side of cultural wokeism, and even at the expense potentially of working men and women's retirement investments and the returns they can get on those investments. So with that, I'll kick it out.
So I think the latter thing that Inez said is very interesting. I hadn't really thought of, the ESG fight from the right's perspective is just so logical and commonsensical for any number of reasons, but I never thought of it as a possible kind of accelerant of sorts for the right to kind of adopt a more kind of working class political posture, or to try to kind of secure and retain and messaging and rhetorically appeal to working class voters. I think that's absolutely fascinating when you kind of frame it like that. I've never really thought about the ESG debate through that particular lens, but that makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's also just extremely telling right? It's extremely telling that this is the first time that Joe Biden, more than halfway into his first and hopefully only term, I should say, has wielded his veto pen. I mean, what does that say about his priorities? I mean, just how far is he, in hock to the woke forces that would have him kind of stand up on this? And it totally cuts against the broader narrative, by the way, that Joe Biden is somehow tacking to the center in advance of 2024. So a lot of people are saying that Joe Biden, through various things, through his, his non-veto of the DC crime bill override, through his restoration, or at least his kind of floating the possibility of restoration of some Trump-era immigration policies, through his budget that we are told is kind of a deficit reduction budget. It really is no such thing. But we are told that he is tacking to the center in advance of 2024. And I think this veto, this completely ideologically zealous, we might say, veto that goes directly against the interests of pensioners and retirees is just a reminder that he is not tacking to the center, that he very much is still largely indistinguishable for probably 90 to 95%, maybe 98% of the issues from his far left flank.
So I would just add a couple of things. This not only shows the extent to which Biden is in hock to woke forces, but also to Wall Street and the ranks of BlackRock and presumably other very major players in the financial services industry do populate senior positions throughout the Biden administration. And BlackRock is sort of the face of the ESG movement. And so what is vetoing this blocking of the Department of Labor's rule, which now says that those who are the fiduciaries for investors are allowed to consider ESG factors as opposed to pecuniary factors, i.e. generating the most profit on behalf of those for whom they invest. Well, it also, this is in some ways, keeps Wall Street's gravy train going, because billions and billions of dollars have flowed into, in fact, trillions of dollars have flowed into ESG in the last 2 decades. And those ESG funds often charge higher rates than normal funds for these companies. So ESG is a massive boon to the financial services industry. And this, in effect, serves as something like a bailout, particularly if you have those running plans like 401ks or pension plans who are going to limit your investing options to include ESG funds. Let's also note that it's not just the pensioners and those with 401ks who are going to be hurt by this, but it's also, to the extent, obviously, the ESG movement proceeds apace, it's going to be everyone, and particularly those who face, in effect, regressive taxes in the way of massively escalating energy and food costs and other costs that the ruling class is effectively insulated from. So on the economic merits, on the theoretical merits, and then in terms of just political logic and the strength of a populist message here, in every single way, this is a disaster. Should be a disaster from the perspective of Democrats. Obviously, they won't see it that way. But to Josh's point, of course, this is telling. This shows you where the president's priorities really are, or at least where he thinks his political power really comes from. And it shows you kind of the myth of the idea that this is the pro-labor working class Joe Biden presidency.
Yeah, I'm glad that that's where we landed, because I don't have a ton to add. What I did want to add, though, is exactly that. The Harvard Law did a long analysis that's very dense with legalese on the difference between the Trump Labor Department rule and the Biden Labor Department rule. They conclude that there's some word tweaks that are meaningful, but overall, they said it's not much of a change. Now, I'm not a lawyer, like Ben and I both are not a lawyer. If you continue to get that inside joke, you're really in the NatCon squad with us in spirit. But I'm not a lawyer like Josh and Inez. But I found that fairly persuasive, that the distinction between the Trump and Biden rule isn't a hugely meaningful one, but that Biden not only does what he does with this veto, but publicizes it on Twitter, films a video, invokes Marjorie Taylor Greene in his decision to veto this rule. That tells you everything you need to know. And it tells you that exactly everything Ben, Josh, and Inez laid out is politically what's motivating Biden here. They really, really, really cannot get over ESG. That's bad for the country, but it's also very bad for the Democratic Party. It's so big of a commitment for them now. They can't really get over it. So on that note, I'm going to transition to myself. Huge news in Eastern Europe as President Xi and Vladimir Putin met this week for a 2-day summit. They toasted to each other with some white wine, had all kinds of friendly words for one another. This comes after China negotiated what looks, at least preliminarily, like a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran last week in a move that some people said looked like China was attempting to usurp America and usurp the West as the sort of moral authority with the credibility to engage in the sort of deal brokering on the world stage as they did last week. I have a quote in front of me that I wanted to read from Putin this week. So he says, this is actually from Xi. He says, together we should push forward these changes that have not happened for 100 years. And he said that during his goodbye handshake with Putin, according to CNN. They talked about the political solution that Xi Jinping has proposed in Ukraine, which would amount to essentially like a ceasefire. Zelensky says it's a non-starter because it would allow Russia to just kind of regroup and not leave Ukrainian territory that they're occupying and continue its assault forward. Putin has said, quote, many of the provisions could be, quote, taken as the basis for a settlement. So clearly, you can see what Xi Jinping is doing in Russia this week. About $12 million worth of Chinese drones, a drop in the bucket compared to what we've spent on this war, have been used and wielded against the Ukrainians by Vladimir Putin. But I think, for all of our disagreements about the United States' involvement in this conflict, none of us disagree that what Vladimir Putin is doing is a humanitarian disaster, that he is ultimately in the invasion, the invader, thus the aggressor. And so Xi Jinping's decision to stand beside him, toast the man who has instigated this invasion with white wine and pretend to be impartial in the conflict, that is such a clarifying factor and should be such a clarifying factor for anybody who is seduced by China, for anybody who's feeling down on the United States and says, hey, maybe we shouldn't be sort of the leader on the world stage. Maybe other people can fill this power vacuum. Fine, argue that we're too involved on the world stage. I'm mostly in agreement with that. But if we leave a vacuum, it's going to be filled by China. And that will have implications not just for people in Russia, not just for people in Ukraine, but for people in the United States inevitably, because we all have nuclear weapons, and that means our borders are all right next to each other, whether we like it or not. What did you guys make of the summit this week?
So I guess for me, I have, I guess, a slightly kind of, I don't want to call my take edgy in advance. Maybe it's not that edgy, but I was kind of waiting for someone to kind of give somewhat of a more, like a higher level take before I kind of give my take. So my take on this is, look, we know China is evil. China is the number one geopolitical foe of the United States this century. That is fairly undisputed. I think all four of us would readily agree with that, no matter how much there are still many recalcitrant elements of the bipartisan uniparty that are resistant to recognize China for the threat that it is. But what I would say to this, and I was actually discussing this with a friend at dinner earlier this week, to me, these photos of Xi and Vladimir toasting, and this is not the first time that they have had these very kind of cozy photo ops together, it to me just underscores the insanity of U.S. current policy and its approach to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and frankly to Russia in large swaths of kind of the post-Cold War era in general. So Russia is obviously the biggest country in the world by landmass. China is the third largest country in the world by landmass, Canada being second, although so much of it is obviously uninhabited. If you look at literally at a map, if you look at Russia and China combined, that is a huge menacing and threatening part of Eurasia, of the broader Eurasian landmass. And while I have no delusions of grandeur about what is in, kind of the political history of Russia and the various kind of terrible regimes, from the Tsars to the Bolsheviks to Putin, there's really very little in the way of kind of fertile soil there, you might say, for kind of Manasonian, Tocquevillian democracy or anything like that. But having said all of that, from a sheer kind of realpolitik perspective here, and kind of sobering up to the reality that we are currently in a multipolar world, and the rest of our adults' lives may well be in a multipolar world where China is clearly a superpower, is clearly already and is only increasingly going to be a regional hegemon. This whole summit and these photo ops of Xi and Putin just underscored to me the myopia and the general short-sightedness of the U.S. just continuing to further and further entrench itself by provoking Russia, only making kind of this reverse Nixon to China possible move, which was probably already a long shot, but only making that just so much of a long shot that it is borderline, just at this point, frankly, inconceivable. So that was my takeaway from the summit. But the fact that Russia and China are cozy on the geopolitical stage is nothing particularly new. They are obviously both also cozy with the Iranian regime, but it's bad stuff. I mean, there's no way to look at this photo op of Xi and Putin in Moscow and smile about it. It's obviously quite nefarious.
Yeah, I mean, I think my realpolitik, as we discussed a couple of episodes ago, my realpolitik assessment of this is quite different. Every administration, American administration, right, has tried to reset relations with Russia to absolutely no avail. To the extent that there was ever possible to pull this kind of reverse Nixon to China move with Russia, I think certainly it died with the Russiagate hysteria domestically in the United States, which made it very difficult for the Trump administration to be seen as being friendly to Russia. So to the extent that there was ever a chance, which I doubt to begin with, I think it died with our own facetious and hoax-like investigation into Russiagate. But I don't think there was much chance of it ever. I mean, I think that there are elements of Russian culture and Russian governance that will always be at odds with the West. And I similarly have no delusions about a like sort of democratic or liberal Russia. I don't think that is in the cards at all. But that being said, I think once analyzing this and once looking at the fact that they are cozy, and I think that it would be foolish for us to think that we can break apart that coziness at this point, even if we disagree on to what extent it might have been possible 3 years ago or 5 years ago. Certainly now, I think it's not really possible, and we have to regard them both as essentially Russia being the larger partner here, and China being the larger partner, and Russia being the junior partner. In which case, it's showing that, or denying Putin control, for example, of key resources in Ukraine is very important to U.S. national interest. But I think there is no real way at this point to split those two countries, those two rivals of the United States, one much more important in terms of capacity, and that would be China. I don't think there's really any real way to split them apart at this point.
Well, obviously, it's tough to engage in the counterfactuals. I would say that just as much as the U.S. and Russia have differences, historical, cultural, political, so too have Russia and China historically as well. Now, they still view us as, the hegemonic world power to ultimately be toppled or at least balanced against. But I think it is worth noting that it's not as if Russia and China are natural partners, let alone allies. And it's beyond unfortunate that we've ended up where we are with Russia, China, Iran, and a whole slew of other malign regimes, all balanced and aligned against us. What would be in America's strategic interest would be to seek to divide them and play them against each other in whatever ways and using whatever tools we can. Obviously, we've gone in the complete opposite direction, essentially. I would also just raise, because I think it's worth underscoring this point, who benefited most from Russiagate? And I would say that China is the power that benefited most from Russiagate. And that's something that should never be forgotten when we talk about it, but often is, because there are a whole slew of other horribles in the parade of horribles associated with Russiagate. The last thing I would say is, there's obvious strategic incoherence here, as well as, well, apparent strategic incoherence here as well, if you were looking at this from the perspective of what is America's national interest. When you have the Biden administration, and I think the Biden administration's effective policy, and this ought to be stated loudly and clearly, is regime change in Israel, putting the screws to the Netanyahu administration and anyone on the Israeli right, essentially, at the very time that the Biden administration continues to bend over backwards for a nuclear deal with Iran, which should be seen as a nuclear deal in effect with Russia and China as well, because obviously a nuclearized Iran will ultimately serve to their benefit. The fact that China negotiated what appears to be some kind of détente between the Saudis and Iran is obviously, I believe, disastrous as well, although some have said that you ought to take a more measured look at that. I also think, by the way, just to go back to that counterfactual one more time, because it's worth saying, is it any more unlikely that the Trump administration could have helped to create wedges between Russia and China than we would have had the Abraham Accords? I think it's an interesting debate that maybe we could have down the road. But last but not least, these powers, I think first and foremost, we ought to be thinking about what they're trying to do to create an alternative to the US as the world's reserve currency, because I think they view that as the ultimate starting point of the death knell of America and their ascendance. And as we move towards, a central bank digital currency here, which follows in China's footsteps, by the way, I think we're paving the path to the best interest of China and Russia, not America's national interest.
All right, so let's stay on the foreign policy topic and take us home here with a segment on the 20-year anniversary of the Bush-led U.S. invasion of Iraq. I remember it vividly. It was March 2003. I was sitting in Nick Nardullo's 8th grade classroom. It was kind of right around the time that I was first starting to follow, current affairs, and I remember the visuals on TV of the bombs and the explosions and all of that. So, there's a lot to think about here. 20 years. I mean, the fact that Ben referenced Iran there is kind of a nice segue, because there is no more foreign power that is more deeply ingrained in Iraqi political fabric to this day than the Iranian regime, which I think says kind of all you need to know about the success or lack thereof of the prolonged U.S. occupation and presence there. Obviously, kind of the initial reason, or at least the purported reason, that we were told for the Bush administration to go into Iraq, the so-called WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, that Saddam Hussein was told to have had, simply did not hold up. There has been no evidence 20 years later that they ever existed. Some others, including Dick Cheney and his wife, Lynn Cheney, also argued that Saddam Hussein had deep, longstanding ties to al-Qaeda. I think that is also seriously in doubt at best. Probably wrong, outright wrong at worst. And I think it is, it is probably not a stretch to say that the general kind of chaos that the Iraq War ultimately resulted in, and the various kind of civil warring and the ethnic sectarian warfare, in large part helped to give rise to the Islamic State, to ISIS. And, here we are 20 years later, and Iraq is extremely far from kind of this, this flourishing bastion of Madisonian, Tocquevillian democracy that I think many in the Bush administration and many in kind of the neoconservative intellectual class, kind of the old Weekly Standard masthead, those kind of folks, is very far, to put it mildly, from what those folks would have thought that it might be. And I guess if I could think of kind of the antithesis of what the NatCon approach to foreign policy is and ought to be, I kind of think to President George W. Bush's second inaugural address and the infamous so-called freedom agenda, where he basically kind of announces this universalist creed that the human soul kind of desires freedom everywhere, no matter who you are, what culture you were born into. After the failure to find WMDs and all of that, that kind of quickly became the ideological lodestar for the United States and kind of the West's broader occupation of Iraq was kind of pursuing this freedom agenda. I think it is very similar to the reason that was given by Samantha Power and Hillary Clinton back in 2011 when they went into Libya. Here we are 12 years later. The country of Libya is still riven by jihadist civil war. That country is also in pretty terrible, dire straits. Afghanistan, we have covered on the show many times. The Taliban obviously controls that country. So what does all that say about the success or lack thereof of nation building crusades across the world? Well, it obviously does not say a whole lot of good. And look, the reality is that Saddam Hussein was obviously a very bad man. I mean, no one here would ever kind of pretend that he was a good person, the same way that no one would ever say that Bashar al-Assad. I mean, Syria is not a country that gets currently talked about a whole lot, but for large swaths of the second Obama term, there was a lot of fairly hot and open debate as to what the U.S. approach to Syria should be. Should the U.S. launch a regime change mission in Syria? I mean, the Syrian civil war is one of the most undercovered and under-discussed humanitarian tragedies of the past decade. I mean, the death toll there, the chemical weapons there, it is abhorrent. It is absolutely abominable. But, can we guarantee that Syria would be better from a pro-U.S., pro-Western perspective if Bashar al-Assad were toppled? I mean, who knows what would come into place? I mean, we would probably just get ISIS or Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra Front, all that all over again. So, look, I mean, this is nothing particularly novel, it's nothing particularly new, but I think the lessons of the Iraq War 20 years later is just a deeply, deeply sobering reminder of the limits in the United States military, which from my perspective, frankly, exists to hunt down and kill the enemy in the least dangerous, most efficient way possible, period, full stop, end of story. It is not there. It is not the Peace Corps. It is not the United Nations. It is not, an ideological kind of belching of trying to spread freedom or democracy or whatever. So I'd be curious if any of you guys have different takes, but the experience in Iraq, I know really, really, really sobered my views. My very first foray into politics, again, I was in 8th grade when this happened. I was kind of a prototypical like Bush neocon in like middle school and high school, and then kind of realizing after the fact what happened, I think very kind of slowly led me to be kind of on the path to I think where I am now. I'm kind of curious what your guys' kind of personal views and kind of substantive takes are as well.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that both the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq initially were started in a kind of Jacksonian impulse of the U.S.'s posture after 9/11. And I think you're right to say that they degenerated, both of them, into this kind of Wilsonian idea of building, nation building and spreading to cultures wholly hostile with no history, a type of Madisonian democracy. And there were similar mistakes made, I think, one that I'm sure Josh would point out as well, the support in 2006 for elections that ended up electing Hamas, right? That was another Bush administration dedication to the idea that all peoples are equally fit for freedom, and there's no cultural antecedent required, or history, or any semblance of the rule of law, or any other sort of antecedent for the actual implementation of democracy. And that's a view that would have been very foreign to our founders, not just in terms of foreign policy, but in terms of the nature of man, right? And the nature of freedom. So I think that's an important lesson to draw. As I said a couple times ago as well, I do think that there should be a great deal of sort of realpolitik and prudence to attach to that. We do have a tendency to always fight the last war, which is part of the reason that we got mired as badly as we did, right, in Iraq, because the last experience of American generals and the American public was sort of a triumphalist one in the first Gulf War. And I don't think that they anticipated how difficult the task ahead of them was going to be. And so I think it's important always to try to think outside of the lessons of only the last war, while also obviously importing, it's not like we're going to ignore what happened in the last war. The third point that I would like to make is I think increasingly we're going to see one of two things, both sort of equally horrifying to me, one of two possibilities. The first is that the U.S. domestic degeneration, division, and institutional capture by wokeness, or I hate that word, but what else can you say? Is going to result in so much incompetence that we are not able to project power around the world. This is the sort of withdrawal from Afghanistan problem, right? Even if you agree with the end goal of withdrawal, we were not able to competently execute it, right? So that's one horrifying possibility. The U.S. simply won't be able to enforce its interests around the world, even in a realpolitik sense. So the second one, almost more horrifying, when we look at the inroads this ideology is making into the military, is that we become an evil empire ourselves, right? That U.S. influence abroad, we still end up being the tallest midget, that China and Russia have deep problems of their own. And I think the failure to drive to Kyiv and topple that government highlights that very, very starkly. Actually, these are powers with deep weaknesses of their own. The U.S. very well could result in being sort of a woke empire in the world, even though our competency is so obviously declining with the introduction of this ideology. So that's the big picture stuff. But since we're doing sort of a retrospective on the last 20 years, that's mine.
Yeah, so I think from my vantage point, I'll probably repeat kind of the tried and true, but I think fundamentals of national security and foreign policy that the failures in Iraq underscore, one of them being you have to know your enemy and know yourself. And I think we knew neither in terms of what our mission and purpose ought to be as a country, and therefore what we ought to do when interacting with the world, and then also who the folks were that we were actually engaging with respect to Iraq. And to focus a little more on that point for a second, essentially, if you look at it in retrospect, George W. Bush paved the way for the Barack Obama and Joe Biden agenda of making Iran the strong force in the Middle East, because by pulling first Saddam Hussein out of power and then engaging in de-Baathification, this made Iraq, in effect, a client or proxy, or at least partial kind of proxy for Iran, therefore allowing it to project substantially more power in the region. And this goes to, again, not only not knowing our enemies, but then also not having some humility and prudence to know that to the extent you are going to destabilize the entire structure that's holding a powder keg from exploding within a country of sectarian violence, that ultimately, if you destabilize that, that's going to have massive repercussions. And oftentimes it's going to go sideways from the perspective of America's national interest. So there were failures on the front end, on top of which, not only did we not clearly define what our mission was there, and a mission that could actually be attained probabilistically and was achievable, but then beyond that, obviously, we had no exit strategy as well. And these are just kind of basic fundamentals that you have to consider in matters of national security and foreign policy. We didn't then. I suspect we don't now. And worse, to Inez's point, we've probably sapped the morale of our troops. We have probably, by dint of our wrong choices and now the wokeism within the military, are deterring others who ought to join from joining our military. So it's not clear that were we in the right war at the right time with the right mission, that we would actually be able to properly and adequately execute it with the people who are in power. So it's disasters all around, on top of course, the lives lost and the dollars in treasure as well expended as a consequence of the invasion there, and then the Iraq war as well. So disasters all around, massively beneficial to our enemies, while China continued biding its time and also gaining valuable intelligence about how we would interact in these kinds of engagements. So all around disaster from the perspective of the U.S. national interest. And again, I would just note the irony that it was effectively the George W. Bush policy that contributed to the endpoint of the Barack Obama and now Joe Biden policy of making Iran the strong horse in the region, the world's leading state sponsor of jihad, as even this State Department acknowledges.
Not to usurp Josh, but I'll just fold this into final thoughts since we're out of time in the Iraq segment, because I can basically say all I need to say about it, with the entire episode sort of in the rearview mirror here, tying things together. It's obviously a different country than the one that we grew up in, very different than the one that our parents grew up in. As we were coming of age, whether we were teenagers or in our 20s, what unfolded in Iraq, I think, forever changed the American people's opinion of their own country. And it's worth sort of remembering what American opinion about our own country was when we went into that war, and why American public opinion was that way. We are 100 years into nuclear technology. This is not something that has ever existed in the history of humanity, and we are a blink of an eye into trying to function as a world with weapons like this at our fingertips. I think at our fingertips and at other people's fingertips that may wish to do us harm. It has caused an immense amount of paranoia, whether the Cold War, whether the Iraq War. It has caused cynicism and abuse of power. There's simply no question about that. But when we are sort of hurtling towards a world, whether it's in the domestic level, looking at the fact that we basically live off of monopoly money at this point, with the bailout of Silicon Valley Bank and perhaps indications that we will just bail anyone out, depending on their size, going forward. So the fact that we're basically printing money, living off monopoly money, and then the fact that we're also that's a technological issue, for one thing, by the way, because we have the ability technologically to do that. We don't need to trade in gold or barter animal hides. But on the other hand, the fact that we also in the sort of world stage are being frustrated. Our leadership is being frustrated on the world stage. It's not something the American people are used to. It's something we did see happen in World War II and in the Cold War. But man, we should get used to it, and we should pay very, very, very close attention to what happens between Russia and China, North Korea, Iran, because multipolarity is here, but the direction it takes is one that can hopefully be influenced by countries that are to be trusted in this space. And we have burnished some of our, we have burned through some of our trust, to be sure. But when you look at the alternative options, when the world looks at the alternative options, it's like what Winston Churchill said about democracy itself. Or what was it, democracy or capitalism? What's the Churchill quote? It's the
democracy.
It's democracy, the best of the bad options. So we'll hopefully not have to be that cynical about our own country. It is a great country and we're great people, but we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Yeah, I'll add just an aside, since we're talking about sort of the geopolitical alignment of the biggest countries on the planet and the potential multipolar world. One thing that I don't think gets discussed enough, and I'm by no means an expert in it, but I think actually George W. Bush deserves some praise here. What he did under his administration was try to build solid relations with India. If Russia and China are going to be linked at the hip for the foreseeable future, it makes a lot of sense for the United States to reach out to the other enormous country, democratic country, even, and not to foolishly offend them. And unfortunately, that's really what we've done. I think President Trump had quite a good relationship with his counterparts, with Modi and others in India. It appears that Joe Biden does not. There was one incident in particular that I recall from April of 2021, where there were desperate requests from India. And however people feel about the vaccines now, there were desperate requests from India to ship some of the I think it was AstraZeneca, it was some other vaccine that was not even approved for use in the United States, but nevertheless we had stockpiled some number of millions of doses of it. And there were requests from India to give that. And if you recall, early in the pandemic, Trump personally negotiated with India to get some of PPE supplies to the United States. So there was goodwill there, and they had done us a solid. We did not do them a solid. I'm not clear why that happened, but I think that it's worth keeping an eye on U.S. relations with India as increasingly we look at a multipolar world with sort of Russia and China on one side. It would behoove us to try to make it so that it's U.S. and India on the other side, and I don't think we've paid enough attention to that. I do want to make one unrelated point to global politics in my final thoughts. There's just been a story that broke by Aaron Sabarium over at the Free Beacon, on whether or not the students at Stanford Law School that we discussed last time will face any consequences for something that the FedSoc chair, Tim, broke on a podcast that I do over at IW called At the Bar on legal issues. He said that some of the students were not only screaming at Judge Duncan for a variety of other reasons, but also specifically they threatened him and his family. They screamed, they hope that his daughters get raped. There are no consequences for that kind of behavior at Stanford Law School. They have ruled out any kind of consequences for the students participating in it. The DEI dean is on leave. I just kind of see that as a papering over. I'm pretty sure they're just waiting for this to sort of pass, right? That actually the backlash pass, and then they're going to bring her back on board. So no consequences at Stanford Law School for this kind of behavior. I think that has implications, very clear implications for the DOJ, for DA offices, right? For citizens who are accused of politically unpopular crimes and all the other ways that the rule of law is critical to the American way of life. I think the fact that Stanford Law School is essentially endorsing this behavior for the next crop of elite lawyers is highly relevant.
Well, I'll pick up on that. I don't think it's quite as bad as Inez is saying. I would agree. I would have wanted, and I have said, I've advocated for much more than this, but the fact that the diversity Krat Steinbach is on administrative leave is a win. It's not like a total win, but it is definitely a partial win. And specifically kind of the 10-page letter that the dean of the law school, Jenny Martinez, has put out, which broke fairly shortly before we hit the record button on this show. So I haven't had the time to kind of pour over it with a fine-tooth comb, but I did kind of skim it pretty quickly. So there's a lot of very good stuff in there. I mean, she specifically says that the law school will not use DEI as an ideological excuse to impose a hegemonic orthodoxy when it comes to any number of issues. There's a paragraph that our friend Delia Shapiro kind of tweeted out. So it's a very good paragraph. I think, if I remember correctly from what I skimmed, there was going to be remedial First Amendment free speech training for the students and the faculty, and I assume also the administrators at the law school as well. Pretty hilarious that the second-ranked law school in the country has to have remedial free speech training, the kind of thing that you wouldn't need to do for someone just in middle school or high school. But you know, I that's neither here nor there for present purposes. I do obviously agree that these students should be punished, ideally expelled. The model here is I was there in person, actually, in April 2019 when my friend Eugene Kontarovich, the law professor and legal writer when it comes to any number of issues, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So Eugene was at University of Chicago Law School giving a talk on the constitutionality of anti-BDS legislation. And this one provocateur of a law student organize, effectively kind of a shout down mob where pro-Palestinian activists, I was literally there. I was standing there in person. I saw this happen, and Eugene handled it like a pro. And long story short, the law student who organized this, University of Chicago Law School, they basically said that you are kicked out of class. You are suspended for the remainder of the school year, and you are not allowed to reapply for admission for another 3 or 4 years. So de facto expulsion. I thought Chicago should have made a more public face of this provocateur of a student, so as to kind of hopefully try to galvanize support for this sort of punishment in other institutions of higher education. That obviously is the ideal model. Certainly these abhorrent, vile, loathsome cretins who are shouting at a federal judge that they hope his daughters get raped, for God's sake. They should absolutely be expelled. I strongly agree with that. But, one other thing is that kind of, voices for sanity. I'm not even going to call them right-wing voices. Voices for sanity on the outside can and should be working to try to get these people's names in front of, possible bar examiners for possible purposes of not getting admitted to the bar. Unfortunately, a lot of this behavior now is kind of de rigueur at a lot of large law firms. It is expected, let alone, it's definitely not frowned upon. But at a bare minimum, there were definitely at least some outside voices and organizations and actors who can try to still make a stink out of this thing, even if punishment is not going to happen for the students from Dean Martinez, notwithstanding her otherwise fairly sound letter.
Well, first, I would just underscore Inez's point regarding the criticality of India and how telling it is that the Biden administration has taken, I would argue, something close to, if not overtly, a hostile posture towards Modi and India's government. And I can only think that the Biden family's dealings, specifically with respect to China, might have something to do with it. Leaving that aside for a moment, I will say sort of one positive and one negative about America's financial situation, which obviously impacts these geopolitical issues. I've long felt, and I've kind of been teasing this theory out, that ESG would not have existed as a movement were it not for the Fed's easy money policies and really the blowing of a massive bubble to cover for the last bubble that collapsed in 2008, 2009, 2010 to some extent. That cheap money, now that it is over and interest rates have ratcheted up, may well have punctured the ESG bubble. And I think that that can be seen in the collapse of SVB, where you have a number of companies, a substantial percentage of their portfolio, their loan portfolio, their depositors, who were startup companies. Those startups themselves may never have gotten funded were it not for the easy money. And many of those startups, of course, had a very woke sort of tinge to them, if not were outright in the green business, for example. So to some extent, the ratcheting up of the interest rates may well kill ESG to a point, while at the very same time, of course, the administration, through the veto of this bill, provides somewhat of a lifeline to ESG, a boon to ESG. I will say also, however, that the fact that we are talking about potentially bailouts in perpetuity now, and they are bailouts of uninsured depositors, only indicates further America's total financial insanity with respect to the public spending, obviously the moral hazard and the kind of behavior that's going to encourage. But even beyond that, the fact that our finances are in horrendous shape, only accelerated, of course, by the Chinese coronavirus response. And this at the same time that Russia, China, et al. Are working to de-dollarize and decouple themselves from the US and the US dollar. And the US dollar, of course, as the global reserve currency, is really the backbone of our ability to project power globally, in no small part, of course, because it's so critical to our economic standing. So all that said, a positive of the ratcheting up of interest rates is the perhaps decline of ESG, but the negative is that we're not accounting for the fiscal recklessness and irresponsibility, which of course is always the long-term problem that no one cares about in the short term, but ultimately is going to lead to a serious reckoning. And ultimately, I believe, the diminution of American power.
All right. Well, on behalf of Emily, Inez, and Ben, I am Josh Hammer. We'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.